Sean Strawbridge, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
So I see from your bio on LinkedIn, you've done a lot, but we'll say you're an investor, you're a partner in Voyager Energy Ventures, and something really cool. You're the former chief executive officer of the largest energy port in the hemisphere, the port of Corpus Christi. That was not something I knew. What was it like running a port that big? I mean, it's got to be an incredible, we call that a big job, I think. Tell the audience what that was like.
Well, Peter, the Port of Corpus Christi is the largest energy gateway in the United States for American energy exports. It's number one in crude oil exports from the United States, number two in liquefied natural gas, and number three in refined products, about a million barrels a day of refining capacity in and around the Port of Corpus Christi. So it's become a very important gateway for energy exports from the United States to our allies and our partners, which certainly your listeners can appreciate now more than ever the importance of American energy in Europe and in Asia, given the geopolitical dynamics that we're seeing in the Middle East, certainly in Ukraine, and some of the saber rattling with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, so then I had to give you a great appreciation for energy globally. What are your current thoughts just generally? There's so much coverage of energy, but what is something that not everybody's hearing in terms of energy policy and our global trading partners?
Well, one of the things that I think is important to continue to recognize is demand for energy, all forms of energy, continues to grow globally. You know, it is expected that another 2 billion people will be born between now and 2050. Most of those in developing nations like India, and they have a appetite for continuing to strengthen their economies, and that's not going to happen without energy security and a heavy dependence on energy of all forms. So when we talk about hydrocarbons, crude oil, natural gas, these are going to remain centerpieces for energy policy for decades to come. And we've heard a lot about the energy transition. We've heard a lot about atmospheric decarbonization initiatives. Those are also extremely important. So it's the same energy companies who are producing traditional sources of energy today that have a desire to remain relevant in the industry and continue to return sufficient returns for their investors and their shareholders that are also going to promulgate that energy transition. But we've got to do that in a meaningful way and a thoughtful way. And there's just been a lot of saber rattling, partisan saber rattling in the political sphere, vilification, if you will, and I think unfairly so, of the energy, the traditional energy companies. These are the companies that are going to move us in the direction that we need to go if we're serious about atmospheric decarbonization. So I don't know that the average voter, particularly in that 18 to 34-year-old voting block, which is the largest voting block in the United States, has a full appreciation for that or for how power gets to their wall to charge their mobile devices, or how natural gas gets to their stove to cook their food, or how gasoline or electricity gets to their automobiles for mobility. I think there's a lack of full understanding for the entire value chain there. And that's really something that we in the industry have to continue to do a better job of messaging, is the importance of making sure we're meeting today's needs and having that eye towards the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we hear that, a lot of times the US isn't doing our part. But one thing that I like to point out is that we've actually done a great job with decarbonizing from coal to gas. And that transition from coal to gas has really reduced our CO2 emissions. And gas is a fuel that's used for power generation and also for cooking, as you say. Tell us about the role of natural gas globally. And can the US be a real player in exporting the gas? We have a great gas resource, as do others. But, given the tensions with Russia and Ukraine, I know Russia's a big gas exporter traditionally. what role can the US play with our gas supply, and what role does gas play in the energy transition?
Well, Peter, many of your listeners may not know that today the United States is the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. We're exporting over 14 billion cubic feet per day from the United States. And the forecast is that will likely double between now and 2030, with projects that are already past FID and are in various stages of construction. And that is the appetite, again, the growing appetite that I mentioned, the global appetite for energy. Natural gas is going to play, and it continues to play and does play today, a center role. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize, to your point about the United States engaging in significant decarbonization in the public utility, in the power generation space, they have decarbonized over the last 15 years by over 15%, had 50%, excuse me. And that cutting of those emissions in half was not through draconian regulations. That was not through significant government intervention. That was through sheer innovation in extraction technologies, energy extraction technologies, hydraulic fracturing, more commonly known as fracking, which is a word that I wish the industry had come up with a better word than that, because it sounds like a cuss word. But the reality is that has propelled the United States to now being the largest producer of natural gas on the planet, which allows us to not only decarbonize, move away from solid fuels, as you mentioned, coal, but also have enough left over to liquefy and send to our allies and our partners. And had we not been in that position, the European Union would not be in the position that it is today with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Had we not been in a position to step in and supplant that Russian gas with American gas, they would be wholly dependent on Russian gas and wholly dependent on that nefarious despot, Mr. Putin, for their energy needs, allowing him to continue with his expansionist agenda. So it's those types of situations and innovation. And then, of course, the public policy allowing the United States to export its crude oil for the first time in 40 years. That had been banned up until 2015. And now it's one of the largest exporters of crude oil produced in the United States and exported to our allies and our partners. So, American exports today, when you look at goods value, aircraft and aircraft parts was number one for decades. Now, aircraft and aircraft parts are number four in goods value, and the top three are crude oil, liquefied natural gas, and petroleum products. So you can see how important the traditional energy space is to our economy and certainly to the economies of our friends around the world.
Yeah, I just think that's so critical. So many people had the Ukraine flag in their bio and supporting Ukraine. I think the story needed to be told that one of the ways we support Ukraine is by exporting energy into Europe, because, as you say, we would be beholden Europe would be beholden to Russia if it wasn't for those exports. How do we do a better job of telling that story, and why do you think it doesn't get told better?
It's a great question. And there's no doubt that in my mind, and I've been in the energy space a long time and I've been in the transportation space a long time, there's no doubt that mankind has played a role in increasing atmospheric carbon concentrations. No doubt in my mind that some people will still have that up for debate. I think that debate is over. So then the question is, what is the solution to that? And the solution in some corners of thought is to leave fossil fuels, leave oil and gas in the ground because they consider it a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, which it very well may be. But it's also one of the densest forms of energy and one that all of societies have been beholden to. In fact, what some of your listeners may not realize is less than half of the crude oil that's consumed globally is consumed in the mobility space. More than half of crude oil is consumed in manufacturing and petrochemical space. And that's the manufacturing of things that we use in our daily lives, whether that's medicines, medical devices, apparel, footwear, electronics, things that have increased the longevity of mankind. And so we have to really be realistic about what are alternatives to fossil fuels. And there's not a lot, and there's not a lot that are going to really supplant fossil fuels when it comes to manufacturing. So let's look at then how do we solve for the impact of consuming fossil fuels as opposed to reducing the consumption of fossil fuels, which then creates this dichotomy in activism, certainly in political circles and in public policy. I think as long as we all recognize that there is more to do in reducing atmospheric carbon concentrations, and let's focus on those solutions. And that includes other non hydrocarbon solutions like hydrogen and whatever derivative form hydrogen can be produced in.
It's interesting you bring up hydrogen. We were so enthusiastic as investment bankers, a couple of years ago for hydrogen. We've been involved in a project and it really started to take off. And over the last, let's call it few months, we've seen it, I think, stall out a little bit. I think one of the big reasons was we haven't gotten clear guidance on the 45V tax credit. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts around what's the right policy or what's the right way to incentivize some of these new fuels, whatever kind of fuel it is, but a lower carbon fuel or a zero emissions fuel like hydrogen? How do we get it out there? There's a real big chicken or an egg problem, I think, and we could figure out how to sort of push it out there. Some market mechanism might have something.
Look, I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of the policy guidance language, or PGL, as we say, when a federal agency puts out PGL or policy guidance language on the 45B production tax credits that were enacted under the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of those challenges, I fear, are a classic case of perfection being the enemy of progress. You look at the energy availability credits, the EACs that they're talking about there. There's really three pillars to that. There's the temporal matching, which is that you are consuming. You're not in this combined cycle where sometimes you're consuming. If you're a producer and you're running a hydrocarbon, hydrogen, you're producing hydrogen through electrolyzers that are being powered by the grid, so to speak. You've got to be able to, in this temporal matching, show that on average over whatever period of time, it's 100% renewable. That's the first pillar. The second is availability. It's got to be available. It's got to be new availability, right? So it can't be existing renewable energy. It has to be incremental from a certain date, has to be incremental production. That means more investment in wind and solar and geothermal and perhaps others. And then the third is, of course, availability. It's got to be within that region, right? It has to be produced within the region that you're consuming and producing hydrogen. I think that all of that is good-willed and well-intentioned, but unfortunately, the reality is it's going to make it so difficult that it will likely throw a wet blanket over the investor's appetite to pursue these types of projects, even with the robust PTCs that exist in the IRA. So that's really our concern is, and we've been very public about it. Here in Texas, Texas is the largest producer of renewable energy in the country, double California. And yet, because Texas has been at the forefront, essentially what this policy guidance language is intimating is that significant, nearly 60 gigawatt of existing renewable energy that's available in Texas cannot be used for hydrogen production. To me, that makes no sense whatsoever. You're going to strand the early adopters with this type of policy because you want to see, further growth and development in renewable energy production. At some point, you got to let the markets, the markets are efficient. You got to let the market efficiency find its equilibrium. And that's what I fear is that likely, I suspect that these three pillars may have some adjustments in them for a period of time in order for us to meet that 2030 goal of, I think it was stated by the Biden administration, the stated goal is 10 million metric tons of green hydrogen produced on the continent by 2030, 20 million by 2040, and 30 or 40 million by 2050. Those are ambitious goals because these are very capital intensive projects and they're going to need investors in the private sector are going to need certainty, not only in what are the requirements, but certainty that they're going to get the permits when they need them so they can get the FID and get these projects underway and get the product to market.
Yeah, no doubt. We saw at least 5 or 6 projects get put on hold as a result of the guidance or lack thereof that came out, and they were good projects with good developers, but these whether it's hydrogen or low carbon ammonia or methanol, all these different types of projects, they have long engineering times in front of them, so it's already very difficult for smaller developers to get financing for that kind of stuff because there's binary outcomes. And then there was a lot of excitement around the IRA, but then the lack of guidance really caused people to pull back. And now everybody that was looking at them is looking at other types of projects like battery storage or even gas turbines, just because it's so hard to get these things done. And then the whole class 6 permitting issue, which is another one. So lots of challenges in the space. My personal view is we just have to get supply out there so that there's ample low cost supply so that the consumption side can take off because you've also got to solve for that, which is have enough consumers of low carbon hydrogen, whether it's engines or whatever else.
Well, and this is where, Peter, it's important to have a partnership between government and industry. We're seeing that in the European Union. A good example is the Port of Rotterdam is investing its dollars into a hydrogen distribution network. So when you look at the large consumers, whether it's the utilities or the refiners in Northern Europe, the Port Authority is actually building the centralized distribution network with public funds to de-risk some of that infrastructure cost and continue to promulgate more availability of hydrogen and whatever derivative, as you said, whether that's methanol or ammonia or MCH, whatever the case may be. We've got to do that here in the United States as well. And that's what the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA was supposed to do. And I give the Congress and the administration, the Biden administration, high marks for getting that legislation passed. The problem is once the legislation passes, there are the federal agencies that have to engage in oversight and permitting. They didn't quite get the memo, in my estimation, and it's still business as usual for them. And while there's no cap on the PTCs from a dollar standpoint, there's certainly a cap on the duration. And if we're going to spend 6, 7, 8, 9 years going through federal permitting, there is nobody in the investment community who's going to have the appetite for that. That's what we've got to do a better job of impressing upon the administration because all of those federal agencies are under the executive branch that they have to get on board if we're going to see any progress with this legislation. Otherwise, most of the well-intentioned legislation is going to end up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's a great point about the Port of Rotterdam. I think about our US utility grid and how in the beginning it was really all a regulated utility. And then we went through deregulation. We had the innovation that came in Texas with the free market, which I think has done great. But if it day one you said free market build this grid, that would have been tough. And so we're kind of in that stage where we're just trying to get this infrastructure built and off the ground. And so I do think that's a productive role of government to do that kind of big infrastructure in the beginning.
Well, and also from a regulatory standpoint, when you have agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, you have the Environmental Protection Agency, you certainly have FERC. What they should be doing is granting states primacy. Just as the EPA has granted states primacy when it comes to enforcing the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act with their state environmental protection agencies. In Texas, it's called the TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They have not done that when it comes to those class 6 wells for carbon capture, and long-term sequestration. And in the absence of that, the EPA is not in any way structured to be able to handle all of those permits on their own. They don't have the resources, and they probably will never have the resources. What they need to do is they need to fast track those premises of those Class 6 wells to the states and let the state agencies take over. Certainly, the federal government has the ability to provide some modicum of oversight. But in terms of being nimble, states can be much more nimble than our federal government. And that's what we're certainly proposing.
I couldn't agree more. We know of a great project in Pennsylvania, a great project in West Virginia. Both require Class 6 permits. If those states have primacy, I think investor capital would be flowing to them. But because of the fact they don't, it's really put things on hold. So that's a direct, sort of from the market on a couple of cases. And there's multiple others that we've had come and pitch us that we've had to say no to for those types of reasons because it just the investor word for it is a binary risk. Nobody wants to take binary risk on development capital because there's nothing behind it. So it does become a big challenge to getting these things built. Let's transition here and talk about some of your investments. I see in your profile you've invested in a couple of deals. What do you think is a good opportunity for investors today? And I'll give the disclaimer that none of this is investment advice and do your own homework and yada, yada, yada. But, everyone wants to know sort of what is out there today.
Well, Peter, if you think about the energy transition as we've been talking about it, and you think about what are the resources needed to produce some sort of hydrogen derivative, one of the primary resources is water. And in the South and in the West, here in Texas, and certainly out in the Western part of the United States, there are significant challenges when it comes to water security. I'm dialing in from Corpus Christi. We are in stage 2 drought restrictions here today. We have an abundance of seawater because we're right here on the coast. But for our potable water or our industrial water, we are 100% dependent today on the heavens to open up and provide us our reservoirs with surface water for us to be able to capture and utilize through our public utilities. That creates a major stress on our water infrastructure when you look at these large water intensive operations. Here in Corpus Christi, over my tenure when I was with the port, we saw $65 billion of private industrial investment come in over the last decade. With that came over 50 million gallons a day of incremental demand for the region for water. And we've got to figure out how can we increase our water security and yet not put that on the burdens of the residential ratepayers. It needs to be on industry, in my estimation. And the only solution for us here in South Texas that I see as viable is seawater desalination. We have an abundance of seawater as a resource. Seawater desalination technologies have evolved tremendously over the last 20 or 30 years. You look at other venues around the world, like Saudi Arabia, which is the largest producer of desalinated seawater in the world. Over 2 billion gallons a day is produced in Saudi Arabia. You look at the UAE, you look at Israel, which is a large producer now to the point where 20% of their water is exported to their Arab neighbor, Jordan. And they have a very large agri economy in a desert, in a very arid, dry desert state. So this is a technology that the United States has been slow to embrace, but there's tremendous data out there that supports its minimal, if any, marine, aquatic, ecological impacts. So you look at the ecological impacts of drought versus the ecological impacts of seawater desalination, they pale in comparison, very small impacts. And so we need to do, we felt that was an opportunity for investment. And we felt that was an opportunity, a growth opportunity in the United States, particularly focused on hydrogen production. So that takes stressors off the public utilities by having direct relationship with the industrial off takers and ensuring that they have that certainty that they're going to have that H2O when they need it to produce hydrogen, whether that's hydrogen from H2O or whether that's hydrogen from hydrocarbons using water as a cooling resource for their turbines. So we felt that was a great opportunity. Now, at the end of the day, that's been that that's been vilified by the environmental justice constituency. And there's a lot of misinformation and falsehoods out there. And that's what we're having to combat is the fear mongering around seawater desalination. But we think it's a great growth area, not just seawater, but brackish groundwater as well. So that was an area that I felt was appropriate to place some capital in.
It's funny you
Of course,
mention that. It's I've been over to the Middle East and seen the size of the desalination plants over there, and it's truly amazing because it's a desert and they have plenty of water and green grass and everything in the middle of the desert. So they get that water from somewhere. And I always wondered why we don't do it. And you see these droughts in California, the wildfires. Why would we not take advantage of it?
yeah, and one of the challenges, Peter, is that most water utilities are regional or local or municipal, and they don't have the balance sheets for these types of large capital intensive projects, and they don't have the political temerity, if you will. They're overseen by municipal governments or by appointed or elected board members, and when you have a room full of activists who are screaming and chanting and talking about how, it's terrible for the environment. A lot of politicians just don't have the stomach to take that on. And so they kick the can down the road. And that's why it's really important that these are public private partnerships. And it's private capital that we see playing a role. It's private industry that develops and operates these facilities, but it's in partnership with public agencies who provide that public support and help with permitting because there's been a lot of these projects that were undertaken initially by private companies only to have their permit applications rejected, not for science or data or need, but purely for, politics and partisanship. And that's just not sustainable long term. So that's why we're recruiting local governments to support our initiatives with their political support, their community outreach, with some of their guidance and help in educating the communities, but not with public capital, with private capital, because there is a tremendous amount of pent up private investment appetite for these types of projects. But it's not going to happen if they don't have that political surety that the permits are going to be issued and those contracts are going to be the commercial viability, the commercial offtake agreements are going to be realized.
Yeah, no doubt about it. There is so much polarization in the world. I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but how do we control the polarization? I mean, we see so much, but I think because the social media algorithms incentivize outrage and incentivize the polarization, we got to figure out a new model. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't know if you have an opinion on that. It's a little bit off the topic, but as long as we have a political expert on, I think it'd be good to get your thoughts.
Well, one of the things is I think it's important to give everybody a seat at the table so they have a platform in which their voice and their opinion can be heard. And that's kind of a great place to start. Community advisory boards, a lot of town hall meetings, open discussions. You stay until the last question is answered. I think that's certainly important to have that public engagement. But when you know it's the right thing to do, you're not going to always agree with those who are going to criticize. And there will be a tremendous amount of criticism. And unfortunately, some of that becomes personal. Sal Alinsky's 12 rules for radicals. One of those rules was attack the individual, not the institution, because individuals don't like to be attacked. We've got to transcend that. And if you know that it's the right thing to do, it's important to keep going, even though it can be, as Churchill says, when you're going through hell, keep going. When you are going through hell, it can be trying at times. But when you come out on the other side with a permit in hand and with a lot of folks that look back and say, wow, I'm really glad we did that. That's really the satisfaction. I don't have, any answers in this social media world that we live in. All I can say is we need more water in our venues. If we're going to have more economic development and more job security, we're going to have more water. And the only long-term sustainable water solution is seawater. Think about this for your listeners. The world, 75, almost 80% of the world is covered in water. Only 3% of that is suitable for mankind's use. And of that 3%, only 1% is available for mankind's use. The other 2% is locked up in glaciers, in the polar caps, and in some other places. And so we have this abundance of this wonderful resource called seawater that has Mother Nature is very resilient. It has a very fast dilutive effect. You're only reintroducing the brine, as we call it, when you take out seawater, you're left over with a higher concentration of salinity effluent. You have to reintroduce it in a responsible manner into the ocean. And Mother Nature is very resilient. You'll have certain aquatic life that will not want that to be in that hypersaline environment. And guess what? They avoid it. And then you have others who love and thrive in that hypersaline environment, and they will be attracted to it. And that's why there's examples like in Sydney, Australia, where, the coastal ecologists and marine biologists were all up in arms about the potential negative impacts to aquatic life by their desalination facility in Sydney, only to find that after it was up and operational, those fish stocks increased nearly 300%. So a lot of them were proven wrong by their theories. And Mother Nature, as I said, has a high tolerance for resiliency. And I think that's what we've got to do is really embrace some of that. But we can't do anything if we're just going to argue about it. And if there's course corrections that are needed once these facilities are up and operational, we're not impervious to making changes in the projects and agreeing to water quality standards that hopefully will support these concerns by the environmental justice constituency.
I think it makes a ton of sense. Desalination and many other technologies that are good for us. We have to be optimists and forward thinking if we're going to continue to progress as a society. Sean, it's not each episode that we have somebody that knows about politics on here. So I'd be a bad host if I didn't ask you what you think about the presidential election coming up. You could take the neutral ground, of course, but I'd love to get your any thoughts that maybe not everybody's thinking about.
Well, I have fortunately or unfortunately spent a lot of time working on public policy at local, state, and federal levels, and have spent a lot of time in DC. Certainly, the partisanship is disconcerting, and some of the behaviors that we're seeing, across both sides of the aisle. I think we're sending a wrong message to our legacy, to our children, in terms of how one could or should behave. I'm not going to prognosticate on the outcome of any possible election, but I will say that, you know, when you look at some of the policies that were instituted by President Trump, President Biden continued with those policies when it came to trade and trade sanctions and tariffs, when it came to the energy, even though I think there was a little bit of a stumble out of the gate with the Biden administration. I think they now recognize that, traditional energy is absolutely needed and necessary if we're going to support our allies and our partners. If there's a change in the administration again, I think we'll continue to see more support for the energy industry. And I think if there isn't a change because of the kind of landmark cornerstone legislation that the Biden administration passed with the BIL and the IRA, we're probably going to see permitting reform, and we're probably going to see a loosening of energy exports and more promulgation of additional energy of all sources, including fossil fuels, under a Biden 2.0. So I really think that we're in good shape as a country, and we got to just kind of not let the pundits and the mainstream media kind of rattle our cages. I still think we're on a good track. This nation's on a very good track.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Good projects are going to get built. Of course, there's always room for change and improvement, but projects will be built. The Dow's interest rates seem to have peaked, which I'll say that increase in interest rates was a real challenge also to getting good projects done. I think if we could see rates start to come down again, you'll see some of these bigger projects get done. But overall, I'm super positive. It sounds like you are as well. Sean, it's been really great having you on the podcast. Thanks for being on. This has been Sean Strawbridge. Can you tell the audience how to get in touch with you? I know you're on LinkedIn, but if there's anything else you'd like to promote, please do.
Now, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn if you're interested in water or you're interested in energy, please hit me up on LinkedIn. It's Sean Strawbridge, SEAN, Strawbridge, just like it sounds. And I usually read my emails and respond within an appropriate time. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me, Peter.
It was great having you, and I look forward to meeting you in person down here in South Florida.